Far be it from me to ignore playing something that I know that I will like, that my friends hound me for over a year, but here I am again, late to the Disco Elysium party. Super late, even. This video will contain virtually no summary, so let's just jump right into it. The story of Disco Elysium is pretty clearly an abstracted real-world parallel that uses its narrative to cover multiple sets of ideologies. But as many people have pointed out, no one gets off scot-free. No one ideology is presented as an ideal scenario like the protagonist of an Ayn Rand novel. Instead, we see how each of the major and minor ideologies are represented with faults that undermine their own causes. These are often character faults, and so do not always undermine the core logic of the theoretical belief itself, but instead the ways that people drawn to such beliefs are likely to undermine their own cause due to the personalities attracted to them. So today, let's run through the brilliant writing and character construction of Disco Elysium and cover how it places commentary on some of the human tendencies that halt progress for those held ideologies and the world and society we live in. First, Evarart. While a funny character, I'm actually going to cover him first because, in my view, he is perhaps the most common parody of his ideology seen in terms of the internal game's satirization and rhetoric. He is, in theory, a union man, someone who negotiates and defends the workers from bad actions of the corporations that they serve under, and despite everything else that I am going to say, it is important that despite his flaws, he does serve this purpose. Like many of the people in the story, he does genuinely serve what he's supposed to be doing. He's a hard bargain driver, he doesn't let the Union get stepped on by the Wild Pines Group, a massive shipping company that uses Revachol as just one of many hubs for transport and storage. And we can empathize with the Union and the people of Revachol as well, as the outside world seems to generally look down on the people of Revachol as a failed state and slum, bombed and left as an example not to rise against the current governing power. There isn't a lot of respect or prestige afforded to their own, so Revachol needs a strong union to advocate for their rights as much as they can. If it wasn't for their placement in the overall world of Disco Elysium, Wild Pines would probably not even care about the union, and easily just threaten to totally pull out of the area. Luckily for the workers, the placement of Revachol is very, very helpful to the current Isola, with basically 10% of their transportation and cargo going in and out. Revachol is very much needed for them to save money, and Evarart can generally push pretty hard to get the deals done that he wants. Although, as we learn, the deals he wants done are not necessarily in good faith. Evarart is in fact very business-minded, and at least in prior events to the story of Disco Elysium, he had apparently done pretty well in negotiating for the years in the past. This business-mindedness isn't just a positive intuition, though, and that's hinted by the misplacement of his looks as a narrative theme. Evarart is the most immobile and fat character in the game, self-appointed, self-repeatedly so. They make a point that his office is within a shipping crate so that he can be moved around to various places easily if needed without major effect to personally traveling there. He is then clearly supposed to invoke the idea of the fat cat businessman, represented through so much art over the last hundreds of years that I couldn't even pretend to show you a fraction of it. If you've seen any art, you probably know what visual imagery I'm talking about. It's an easy visual metaphor associated with overabundance, normally drawn or shown in association with a starving figure next to them. Except, this is meant to emphasize the self-centered, ruthless businessman, or perhaps all of capital, placing the clear role onto the character that is themselves supposed to be a representative of the voice of the worker, should tip off most people that something is off or shady about Evarart, and in fact, it is. There is a lot that is not on about Evarart. First, we, if looking into the Lady Lorry driver, find out that there is an entire nation-spanning drug trade with routes through all of Revachol, organized by Evarart. But also that Evarart has a twin brother, and that they secretly switch places, apparently, from time to time to get more work done, and to portray the Union's power as ever-present. We're told that the smarter brother is Edgar, but we, to our knowledge, never get to see Edgar in the game. Except, Edgar is described as having a lazy eye, meaning that the Evarart we meet in the game and only ever know as Evarart is Edgar, and the real Evarart is likely somewhere off making deals, checking drug lines, or just generally meeting with other business colleagues to build their empire. A lot of this you have to dig super deep to find out, and in the end, I don't think Harry is ever really able to make the connection with Evarart really being Edgar. So, quite literally, this supposed to be Union advocate captain is undermined by the ideals that he is, in theory, supposed to be fighting against. Rampant corruption, capital, and industry. He's literally a drug lord mob boss holding a port captive for ransom deal from the Wild Pines group, and it is only in interest of securing his position of power in Revachol that he upholds his promises and helps the people. After all, for as long as he is the only force that is ever capable of getting things done in Revachol, people are willing to ignore or look the other way in order to get their share, especially whenever they're so desperate and have nothing. They're desperate. They have no other options. They can't choose a lesser of two evils. It's choose the lesser evil or, I don't know, go drown in the river. This, of course, is an absurd literary exaggeration of some union critiques that point at the exorbitant union dues or high union boss wages that make corporations often try to frame the unions as pro-business, a sort of greedy way that unions act as a secondary interfering force into the workers' lives that serve less to give the worker but to take from the employer. Now, obviously, this isn't a valid critique under most circumstances, but in Everart's case, it shows that, taken to the extremes, this is something that theoretically can happen. But it also adds to that critique that this is only due to the fact that business and capital can give the incentive to gouge even those that you otherwise would save. Like, imagine there's two people. One person charges you to get on the train but stops whenever they feel like it, and one man obtains the power to stop the train whenever he wants but can't control the train otherwise. To live, you have to get on the train, and to get off where you want, you have to pay the other guy. It's like a hostage situation for the worker. Even at this cartoonish level, though, the Revacholian citizens still undeniably need the Union, though. They are benefiting from Everart's place, and so are willing to deal with some of his corruption. Because of the sheer lack of care from the outside corporations, from the government, for the well-being of the people there. Another bit, which is one of the funniest bits for me from Evarart, is in his coaxing Harry to work alongside him to retrieve his gun. Evarart thinks, oh, what if a kid is playing with the gun right now, and so on and so forth. He says some funny stuff. He tells you he has eyes everywhere, and that he can help Harry find it. And there's two possibilities here from the way that he talks to Harry, in terms of how Evarart is willing to present himself. And it says a lot about him. One implication is that he's comfortable writing the line that he has the gun, but wants you to do something for him first. The second is that if he doesn't have the gun, he's overwhelmingly likely to find it before you do, and you'll owe him to get it back sooner or later anyways. Of course, he never says this. He always dances around the point and talks through implication and winks and nudges. He's willing to essentially blackmail an officer of the law and frame it as an exchange of interests, bribe any authority to curry his favor. This isn't wholesale bad under all situations, of course, but it is also an attempt to absolve him through implicating you, to any other crimes or issues that you may discover. In other words, he's doing it for his own interest, separate from the interests of the workers and of the union. I mean, he's the one that talks about a kid getting a handle on it and maybe hurting themselves. The people are not his concern. Instead, it's the drug trade, which is largely tertiary to the actual game's objective, but is in fact very important to the plan that Evarart has going. I do think it's important that the specific crime that the narrative chooses to make Evarart a kingpin of is itself illegal drug trade. Drugs that have particularly enabled and ruined Harry's life personally and terrorized the life of the people around him, but more so, the drug issue that has kept Revachol a poor slum to which people struggle to escape even harder. In this way, in terms of maintaining power over Revachol, this also benefits Evarart significantly. Narratively speaking, and for a casual and uninitiated player, in another sense, this is chosen wisely as a decision. It makes the story so that literally anyone can see, without much deeper political analysis, the business that Evarart benefits off of poisons the very workers that rely upon the business to keep him and the workers fed. So get on the train that never stops at the right place, or pay the guy to get off at the right place. Go with Wild Pines and have no rights and no money, or go with Evarart and have some rights and some money, but have a community devastated by drug abuse and crime. That's just the first piece of the puzzle, though. Joyce, in contrast to Evarart's skeevy businessman persona, has the aura of a trained politician. She's a diplomat who phrases and frames her plight as an inconvenience and portrays kindness through her willingness to take time with you. In reality, she's just a lady stuck on a boat waiting for Evarart to do something or wait until the militia arrive. But despite this lack of work, she portrays herself as the patient one, earnestly searching for a peaceful resolution. And to be fair, she does seem to be doing so at least more than Evarart is. She represents the Wild Pines Corporation. As she makes note, she is not them, she merely has been sent to speak for them. She represents them. This is intentional. This places herself in a way that makes her not necessarily have to defend the corporation, but can place herself as a third party simply trying to resolve an issue. This, of course, isn't true. The more you learn about the Wild Pines' mistreatment, the more that she pushes back. Early on, she mentions how hard-working Wild Pines was and where it got, but after finding out the reason that they got so big is in large part because it was given a large sum of unearned money, she waves it off as a small portion of the reason for Wild Pines' success. It's like that old Trump quote, the small loan of $1 million. When given huge upfront capital, one doesn't need to know what they are doing. They can hire people to know what they are doing and get the wheels moving with very little personal effort. Or it's like with stocks. It's much easier to make a ton of money on stocks if you put $20K in a safe stock and leave it for 10 years, than start with $100 and get really good playing risky stocks on day trading every single day to slowly work your way up there. There is no denying that capital reinvests in capital. The more wealth that you have, the more opportunities and ways that you have for producing that said wealth to a greater extent. Someone poor, working 70 hours a week across 3 minimum wage jobs, isn't going to make enough money to get proper promotions, to get experience and free time and opportunities, to get more high-paying jobs, to get credentials that they may spend their whole life clawing up just to give their kids a slightly better standing point before they die. Even with myself, I grew up in a small meth town where people were broadly poor, and there were times where my mom worked all year and made under the poverty line. But you know what? We always had a house. I had an old computer in my room that barely ran. I'd play Minecraft beta on the smallest render distance and still get 15 frames. But just the fact that I had a stability of a home to come back to, that I wasn't at risk of eviction constantly growing up, and a computer to experiment with and grow my personal knowledge and free time, even if I didn't optimize the time I was given, it still meant I had an infinite amount of more opportunities to get ahead in life, to the point where I could even be in a position to do this as a job today. If I was handed $100,000 at once today, I'm convinced I am aware enough of my finances that I could keep myself financially comfortable for the rest of my life. Capital is never a small part. This idea only comes from people who have never had to actually work for what they have. Do you think working a 9-to-5, making $50K or more a year, and going home to a nice house is harder than starving on the streets in tents, getting ill and trying not to freeze to death in winters? Homelessness is much harder, and you don't get paid for it. You get killed for it. It's obvious which anyone would pick if given a choice, of which one they would rather do. In other words, Joyce represents the cool, unfeeling loyalty to the faith in the system. The underlying assumption that those less fortunate are there by virtue of moral failing. She doesn't likely even see herself as judging them. She does probably feel really bad for them, but she thinks that there is always something that they could do for themselves to not be where they are. She feels bad for them in the way that she feels bad for a rabbit when a wolf grabs it in its mouth. The line of hers that gets quoted the most is perhaps the line, "Capital has the ability to subsume all critiques into itself. Even those who would critique capital end up reinforcing it instead." And this seems valid when set across from Evarart, who is exactly the sort who LARPs to critique capital while in fact finding just another way to carve the market for himself, albeit one that actually does benefit the workers far more than they would on their own. It's crazy and honestly depressing to see how many players of the game seem to take her quote as in any way profound, though. I have worked hard. At the worst points in my life, I've definitely wanted to just quit everything. Not just job, not just school, but life. My acknowledgement of this privilege of capital that I am now afforded that allows me to do this job, which isn't easy, and that my continued support through these things like Patreon and Ko-fi allows me to make my videos, the fact I'm addressing all this, and that with that money I would point out my said privileges as a part of this system, Joyce sees as hypocrisy inherent. She makes a correct assertion that in order to be heard critiquing capital, one must use capital, but this hypocrisy doesn't produce a philosophically incoherent one. She's literally the person that meme makes fun of, the society should improve somewhat yet you participate in society one. Because in reality, when variables are placed within a system and there is a set way to obtain power, obtaining said power to change the means of said power is not contradictory. It's necessary for anything existing within the system. If someone critiques capital while absolving themselves entirely from it, they will die shriveled and frozen in a ditch, having nobody hear their words. Their protest will be in vain. If someone seeks systemic change, they must obtain power to change systems, either from the means of violence and war, like the Revacholians tried but then failed and were bombed to smithereens, or from within the system. The means of which to do so doesn't undermine the change that one advocates for if it's still within the system. This is true of any system. The fact we live under capital currently is only a means of time and place. Let's imagine a society similar to the one mentioned in Plato's Republic. The one where only work is done for the things that people need. There's no luxury. People work to make sure there's enough food, housing, shoes, basic clothing. This leaves people with more time to do art or chat and spend time with others. Plato also argues that countries would never demand land or war or conquer because they have their needs met and don't create opulence. The creation of opulence, he argues, stylish shoes, bigger houses, this creates inequality which leads to want and envy. So how do you critique the lack of excess in a society like this as a person of said society? Well, the easiest way would be to maximize the time creating excess, and to do this, you must invent something to give your set work that is needed a greater means of efficiency. Instead of farming by hand a set amount of crops, you use tools. Instead of tools, you use machines. Eventually, what was your 1 week of work can be done in an hour or less. Or say that your task is to make as many shirts as you can in one day. Inventing a way to thread the fabric quicker, machines that sew or make the fabric more durable, this allows more free time and benefits everyone. You wouldn't say that if a person worked to become more efficient within their society, so that they had more time to spend on creating a freedom to change, would undercut their said reason for the efficiency, right? I would hope not. Or say that you were in a prison, and you want to reform the poor working conditions of the prison. So you become the ideal prisoner so that you're let out early on good behavior. And then with that extra time you got from getting out early, you take to campaigning for prison reform. Only people with power can change systems, and people with power are necessarily people who made it up using those systems. Or take charity, for example. If you get a job as soon as you can, and then give every cent that doesn't keep you fed on charity, you will suffer personally to an extreme extent, and give a decent amount of money. But if you establish a high amount of wealth for yourself, and then commit to giving a set percentage of it to charity, you are both reaping the rewards of a very comfortable, nice life, and keeping the money for yourself, while also using that money to actually help more people than if you had just given all of your stuff from the get-go. You don't become a hypocrite to the idea of helping people with money issues just because you buy some nice things for yourself. As you can see then, from these various other systems, Joyce isn't even talking about capital. She's talking about systems of power. To critique the means of power, one must obtain power. Her belief is a Thatchian might makes right. People are at the top because it is meant to be sort of perspective. It's cruel and unempathetic, but I love Joyce's character because I don't think that she would see herself this way at all. I think she feels sorry for others. She just shelves the responsibility of those people's struggles into a system of unchanging matter of fact and place of the world. This is the ultra-liberal perspective in a sense. Not in an American colloquial sense, but, you know, the way the Europeans use it and how it used to be used. I'm not a Hassan fan, but I find it weird how shallow the critique of him being rich and socialist is. Like, He's the largest political streamer in the world, and a massive part of his ability to do that is his willingness to take on the traits that create power and then direct people toward causes that ultimately help people. At least in the cases that he doesn't say something stupid. The systematic change is what is actually making a difference, not one internet micro-celebrity splurging on stupid gaudy crap. You have money, therefore socialism invalid critique breaks down under any 6th grader's understanding of philosophy. Because if someone didn't have the power to amplify their voice in a critique of capital, then they wouldn't be able to critique capital, because the only means in which somebody's voice can be heard is by gaining power. Here's another hypothetical. You personally don't support what the meat industry does to brutalize animals, and so you generally don't eat meat for ethical reasons. You go over to someone's house, and them, not knowing this about you, has already prepared a meal with meat. It's not hypocritical to eat the meat at this meal. Your actions neither benefit the company that you oppose or harm you personally. The animal was killed and paid for and prepared without your involvement. The only difference in you eating it or not is whether or not it's going to be thrown into the garbage bin. So there are circumstances where an ethical vegan may eat meat without undermining their actual ethical position. But once again, there is a prevalence of this 3rd grader logic. You said meat bad, but you eat meat! That totally ignores and portrays no understanding of the stated reasons for not doing so. Someone who avoids eating meat to disconnect from a system that abuses animals would still be disconnected from that system if, without their knowledge or intervention, a meat product found its way to them. Of course, I'm sure that some ethical vegans would still not eat the meat. It's a matter of personal philosophy and morals at the end of the day, but strictly speaking, it's not contradicting the ethical argument. Or say you decide to boycott Starbucks, but before whatever they did to make you boycott them, your friend bought a gallon of pre-made Starbucks crap in his fridge. I don't know, this is a weird example. Once you've started boycotting Starbucks, there's nothing wrong with you using the resources that your friend bought from before the boycott started. It doesn't make any sense. The point is that you're not supporting them in the present. They don't feel the change in your support if you privately have things that were already bought in the past. To change a system from within is to gain power with said system to change said system. To put it more concisely, a rejection of said system can still benefit a person outside of the system or a future member in said system, even if the system is used to change itself. That's sort of the entire concept of democracy. On the other hand, if the person receives something from the system, but in exchange does not reaffirm or positively impact the system that it receives from, they do not otherwise undermine their lack of involvement. And again, in any sort of ethical food position, if food that would otherwise be thrown away is instead eaten, no variables have changed within the system that contradict the moral position. Only the personal benefit of something going used versus going unused. Another way that we see Joyce following this Thatchian loyalty to systems and power is in her response to the militia showing up. One thing you try to say to reason with the Cornell group is insist upon letting Joyce get involved to stop the possible massacre, but you're informed that she's already left on her boat. She never saw it as her responsibility, and in some sense she is correct. She was simply hired to act as a benefactor to stop a situation from happening that's caused by other people's decisions. She was undeniably trying to reach a deal to her benefit so that the place and the people of Revachol remain irrelevant while hired by the Wild Pines group, but the militia group is their own group. The Union is their own group. The Hardy Boys, the people of Revachol, and you, the RCM. She merely was a benefactor, a messenger of the system, a bot, an arbiter of justice. So when the time came, in her mind, despite being patient with Evarart, he was unwilling to parley with the Wild Pines. So they don't care what happens to Revachol or its people. They never did. They only cared about the deal. It was never their responsibility. They were there for a reason. The reason disappeared, so they left. Once again, it's cold and logical in a certain way, but deeply inhuman and unempathetic. It takes the assumed moral position that those in power deserve power because the system is constant and unchanging, and the system merits those deserving. Therefore, what comes to those undeserving is of their own failing. It's a sort of religious belief in karma that centers around capital. Like I said though, this isn't truly about capital, it's about power. In other situations, one could easily argue that most of the time, long-term capital and well-being is benefited more by short-term profit losses to create happiness and stability. But the means to which capital is invested goes back to shareholders, who expect dividends quarterly, sometimes even more often than that. Shareholders are not a monolith. They can buy and sell and trade and aren't necessarily invested in the long-term aims of individual companies or their workers or even its consumers. Each shareholder has a different aim and motive, normally for their own pockets. And so, because of that capital being the means by which someone obtains power, it limits its own longevity and possibility for short-term gains. This is where the free market starts to eat itself. Such as whenever all the light bulb companies got together and developed a specific limit to how good their light bulbs could be, making it so they were basically designed to fail. Planned obsolescence, it's another thing that Apple has gotten in trouble with. Again, like Evarart, I don't think Joyce personally is a bad person. I think Evarart and Joyce are necessary cogs that pull on each other within said system, but within the system's messy claw for power, the people grinded under their representative factions, the workers, and the lives of Revachol are trampled. That Thatchian worldview. Status quo. Don't change. Get your own stuff. Leave. The system is greater than us all. At the end of the game, we finally discover our long elusive killer, the Deserter. A member of the Communist Party from before Revachol was bombed, hiding out in the bunkers, stealing small canned food and beans, and generally being self-sufficient. Spending a lot of time alone, reading. Never arrested after the war, never shot or killed. And that's due to his name, the Deserter. As the battle seemed unwinnable, and as he, for a moment, feared for his life, he abandoned everything that he had worked for, and he deserted. The Deserter is neither serpent-tongued and jovial like Evarart, or posh and diplomatic like Joyce. He's crass, blunt, speaking with hard edges and no facade in front of his honest feelings. Compared to how nice the other two treat you, despite clearly harboring some resentment, pity, or even threats and contentment, the Deserter knows how he feels about you and says it honestly with no repercussion or feeling of angle. All through the game, you hear about this communist party that took on Revachol, that got rid of the king and were swiftly defeated, but it's almost always framed as an inevitable thing that they got defeated, or like it justifies itself as a failed worldview and ideology due to the individual failure of their state. This is, of course, as you could probably recognize, another might makes right argument. But the Deserter gives insight on why it really failed in the Revacholian case, and it's something that I found particularly poignant for the state of the left as a movement in the post-Cold War era, and especially within the modern internet age, although I suppose it goes back as far as politics have. Why did he kill the military man? After so long alone, without a friend, without a loved one, seeing the world move on, he couldn't continue or move on himself. He states the communists never truly signed a treaty or ended the war, that it was the liberals who signed in their stead, that the bourgeoisie continued to reaffirm their power, and despite the lives going on for decades, Revachol's people became older and poorer, more drug-addled, still abandoned and abused by the systems that they wanted to fight against. So he states occasionally, he would just take pot shots and kill the people that he saw as a part of the problem, keeping the war going in his own mind. The initial reasoning that he gives for killing the militiamen that started this whole story is that through his scope, he saw him having intercourse with a woman that he had begun to fancy from afar, in his scope, in his loneliness. The idea that this militiaman, a savage inhuman who undeniably, from what we learned about him, has ruined so many lives and violated so many people's autonomy, was allowed to take such high pleasure, was a moral injustice to him. So he shot him. Not just that, but he seemed to have spite for the woman, too. The fact that she would grant him such a thing when he is so evil, and so he took joy in taking the shot in the middle of the two's performance, leaving her in shock and horror, hoping to scar her in the event. Punish both of them, in a sense. The more you talk to this socially isolated mind, though, you see that it wasn't completely about the moral failing of that specific man, but a jealousy bred that this evil man got rewarded by life while he, seen himself as a good man, was left to rot in isolation. It was jealousy and ego that led to the bullet, ego justified in political strife. It's the same ego that kept him on this island, after he said as much, that if he had returned to the island at this point, they'd probably just assume he was some vagrant. He wouldn't even get in trouble at this point. He's been gone far too long for anyone to search or care, and the government probably wrote him off decades ago as having died from the bombings or in being in the bottom of the ocean. It's not uncommon for bodies to not be recovered or identified after war, after all, but despite this, him going to the island meant one thing: admitting to himself that it was over, and admitting that he ran from the only thing he ever claimed to care about to save his own skin while his friends in platoon died or ended their own lives. So rather than move on, rather than die or reintegrate, he stubbornly stays, self-punishing himself for decades in a life that ultimately helped nothing. A life that didn't even die fighting for what he believed in, but sat in contentment over the lost time for a revolution and the spite toward future generations who failed to rise up. This is something elsewhere in the game that is also made fun of, in the sense that if you ask your brain what being a communist means, it ends ultimately saying that it's mostly about arguing with other communists. The ego to be the one true representative of the people. The stubbornness to emphasize purity over progress in a way that ultimately breeds neither, and instead leaves the workers, the people, to remain suffering under the rule of liberals and fascists who take means to organize and obtain power. It's this purity and ego that breeds the sectarianism that keeps large parts of the left more concerned over minor grievances when they agree over 98%, rather than major grievances with people that want all of the left dead. Something satirically outlined in such songs as Vanguard by David Rovics, that ends with the self-proclaiming line that he's the only true leftist, and that because no one else is good enough, they're forming a party of one. Or, while we're on songs, here, let's go back to 1951, that has a lot more specific of the timely political commentary. This is to say, from 1951 to 2002 to 2019, art made by left-leaning people has consistently called attention to this failing among leftists that halts any sort of real progress. Sectarianism, not in this context, is often most invoked in religious conversation among different sects of Protestant Christianity. It was even made fun of in classics like Monty Python's Life of Brian, but it's fitting then that we make that connection. The need to create religious hierarchy based on the ego and purity among leftists is ultimately what keeps leftism from doing anything other than self-aggrandizing and staying on an abandoned island pretending that the wars haven't ended yet. It concerns ego over material conditions and placement over people. This ironic prioritization to hierarchy is in fact exactly what many basic leftist goals are trying to dismantle. The systems of power that force those to work up systems in order to be given value within a society. The arguments and egos of how that is handled become its own sets of hierarchies, until leftist communities split into smaller and smaller groups, refuse discussion with each other, stick in with their partisan beliefs, and refuse to engage with other people. People that they like have already told them what to think about, even when these things can be proven untrue. Think of the streamer and video essayist rift in the left political space. That is, if you're terminally online enough to even know what that is. Think of the way that Leftovers ended between Ethan and Hassan, largely due to the community's uncontrollable unreasonability and cruelty. Because if you're not 100% with us, and always proselytizing our exact line, if you dare question us or simply ask for clarification to understand better, be prepared to be punished. That's the tragedy of the deserter. He has no major problem in his analysis of the issues of Revachol, and everything he wanted to stop came back in fruition just as he feared, and even further ruined Revachol and the people of it. But it is people like him who act big and argue while not working on the ground, people like him who discount those who acknowledge defeat and then try to work within the system instead of dying or doing nothing towards their own goals that have always undermined leftist movements. People should debate ideas. It's fine if people disagree, obviously. In fact, that's partially what I'm criticizing here, is that people aren't willing to talk to people they disagree with. If someone is criticized, they have a right to respond. But it is specifically the over-acceptance and moral righteousness of harsh sectarianism, refusing to engage with those who largely advocate for the same social change, that leads unhappy people to self-flagellate themselves and soothe their ego, while letting the world continue burning around them and pretending that they care about it. Disco Elysium does a good job at criticizing the different aspects of ideologies and the sorts of flaws in the sorts of people that they attract. It was an incredibly smart and important game, and there's still obviously buckets more to say. I didn't talk about fascism because it's very obviously stupid for anyone who knows anything about politics. I thought it was more interesting to cover these other characters within the story. But that being said, I had originally planned to make a segment about Titus and the Hardy Boys, as well as the racism stuff with Measurehead, but I kind of liked the way that the deserter part ended, and I didn't want to undercut the final point I was making. If you'd like to see me talk about the Hardy Boys or Measurehead or anything else related to Disco Elysium, or even not related to Disco Elysium, let me know though. I might make a smaller video specifically available to patrons and channel members, like some videos already are. That is, unless this video blows the heck up. Then I'll make it public. Thanks to my supporters though. Please leave a like and comment. I really needed a break from all the Steven Universe stuff recently, but I'm hoping to make this a channel where I can discuss important philosophical and political subjects across multiple mediums, because talking about the important themes of different pieces of art often interact with aspects of political philosophy. Despite being in the position to do the job that I do, it's not easy and it's very unstable. I rely very heavily on the very few sponsors I can get and on the support of you all. So, your support is deeply appreciated. With that, thank you to Daniel Frowsing, Zioma, MJ, and all of my patrons new and old. Leave your thoughts down below. I'm sure that something I said made you have a thought. Go play Disco Elysium if you haven't, because to be honest, if you haven't, I don't think that I spoiled you, really. I'm not sure how coherent any of this will be. Happy holidays, and Happy New Year.